For our next topic in the course, we're going to see how the law serves as a central institution and even a central mechanism as related to Asian exclusion. Now, when I use the term exclusion here, I'm not referring simply and only to, let's say, the law, immigration laws banning Asian migration to the United States, such as, say, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. I'm also referring to this notion of Asians being barred from citizenship, regardless of the fact that there's such a thing as naturalization laws that apply to other ethnicities beyond Asians, notwithstanding the fact that there's such a thing as the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship for all Asian born persons. Okay, now we talked about the Wong Kim Ark case, which actually reversed or repealed the earlier notion of, 14th Amendment not being applied to Asian migrants. But still, before that, before in the 19th century, if you were born in the United States, you were still excluded from citizenship. So, regardless, the law serves as a central mechanism here when we look at the history of Asian exclusion. Now, a central concept we're going to explore, and by the way, I should say we're going to explore this beyond just Asian America or beyond just simply race, is this notion of social construction. Okay, in general terms, this is the central concept that social scientists and some historians and even philosophers they've advanced this groundbreaking work on how much or the extent to which we take for granted as real various institutions, phenomena, events, and so forth, when it's actually socially constructed. Okay, that is to say, it's invented by us humans. We create things like race, like gender, like nation, just to give examples of things we take for granted as being, quote, real, right? We invent those things in our social interactions, and then we go on to believe that they are actually real institutions that exist independent of our own existence, right? As if that, you know, um, the idea of black skin, for example, or blacks or whites or what have you, extends to all times, all places in history, right? So social construction is opposed to essentialism, as we noted in the introductory lecture. And let's recall that essentialism advances the idea that there are certain qualities, certain characteristics, certain attributes that form the essence, right? Keyword essence of a given entity. So when you think of essence, you think of it as being ahistorical. What does that mean? It means like existing in all times, places in history, right? Um, so when you think there's an essence to something, you see it as being, um, you know, beyond history, as I just mentioned, but also as being natural, as being unchanging qualities, unchanging characteristics. A fancy word for this is immutable, that they are immutable and intrinsic properties belonging to this particular group or this particular institution. All right. Now, you could see how the idea of essence or essentialism is used or conceived when we think of something as being real and not socially constructed. For example, in science, we don't question certain things that we take for granted or that we accept as real. For example, water, H2O. We know that there's an essence, to use our term, to water, and that's, two molecules of hydrogen and one molecule of oxygen, H2O, right? That's the essence of what we call water. And we say, well, this exists independent of our human existence in all times and places in history. It's always been like this. H2O, that's the essence of water. Okay. So, but that's scientific reality. What about social reality? This is what we're pointing towards. All right. What we do is commonly use the same line of thinking, the same logic applied to social reality, social phenomena, social institutions. And here's where we see this idea of essentialism spilling over to the social world. Um, Social construction, in other words, can be applied to all these areas that I just discussed that we take for granted as being essentially real, right? For example, I just mentioned nation, right? We take for granted, many of us do, that nation exists ahistorically, that this notion of American, or for that matter, Irish, Italian, Chinese, Nigerian, pick any nation, right? Many of us assume that this is something real, not socially constructed, not invented by us, human beings. And therefore, we forget that, there was no such thing as America or American, really, as defined by United States before July 4th, 1776. Sure, they used the term American, but it's a different way of thinking about, quote, American than it is, quote, excuse me, after July 4th, 1776. Okay. Similarly with other nations, right? Um, the idea of German was not around until Germany was formed as a nation state in 1871. Before then, you had Germanic speaking people, but it wasn't until this modern notion of a nation being created, again, a social construction, that they said, okay, we're going to take all these people, these various principalities, and create the German nation, right? And then after you create the nation, you promote this notion and even ideology that your nation, let's say Germany or United States or what have you, is actually a naturally existing thing, right? When in fact, it's a social construction. To use a term of a famous academic, he used the word, when it comes to nation as social construction, he used the term, quote, imagined community, right? That is to say, we imagine this community of people like us, when in fact there's arguably more variation than similarity. And the only thing we really have in common is that we happen to be located within these arbitrary boundaries. They're arbitrary in the first place, um, that we call, say, the United States or other nations, right? So the nation here, we're arguing, is a social construction. Similarly, you could say other things like even something as everyday and taken for granted as gender. Okay. Gender, there's a difference between, say, sex and gender, though we use them interchangeably. Now, we know that sex is something that's natural. People are born biologically males, people are born biologically female, and we seem to associate certain behaviors among the two, right? When in fact, social scientists and so forth argue that, gender, let's just say that people are born with, differences in terms of sex and even chromosomes, right? XX and XY. But people are not born with gender. Gender is something that's learned and created. For example, blue goes for baby boys, pink goes for baby girls, right? But when we really look at it deeper, the gendered behavior that arises and thought to be natural is actually created by people, particular to societies, to cultures, even to nations, right? Other countries have different ideas about gender. Some people believe there's such a thing as the third gender, right? when in our Western society, we just see it as two genders, male and female, but other cultures take for granted three genders. Okay, so there's variation, variability points towards the fact that gender is actually a social construction as argued by social scientists. Okay, I should just say this. At one point, before, let's say, 1930, this idea of blue for boys and pink for girls, that was actually the reverse. It used to be pink for boys and blue for girls. Okay, interestingly enough, during much of the 19th or most of the 19th century, spilling over to the 20th century. Okay, and then it changed over things like women belong at home, right? That idea. Well, that used to be true before recently with the service economy, for example, when it was realized that a household had to have two breadwinners in order to fit in the middle class. Okay, but before then, in the 1950s and before that, it was felt that women belong at home, and that's a particular gendered role, right? So all these ideas, in fact, what was once masculine, quote unquote, in American society was different in the 19th century than it would be in the 20th century. All right. In other words, what are the qualities that are supposedly associated with manliness and masculinity were different. Okay, so it's always changing. Historically, you see variation and evolution and change. So this points again to the idea that gender is a social construction. Now, here is what we have to think about when we see, or excuse me, when we think about social construction. And this is what you could call social construction and its aspects. Okay. So, some of this we already discussed, but it's getting a little bit more deeper into it. First of all, the phenomena of our social and cultural worlds and their meanings that are attached to the, events, phenomena, institutions, so forth, are created in social interaction. So that's important. It's, social, right? Human beings inherently are social beings. And as we interact with each other, that's when this idea of invented or fictional or socially constructed phenomena arise. Okay, so social interaction is central here. Um, Moving on to the next part, such social phenomena are thought to be natural. This is what we discussed, right? They're obvious. You don't even question it. For example, race again. It seems natural. It's obvious to many of us, most of us probably, right? Therefore, if it's natural, you don't really question its existence unless you're a philosopher in the ivory towers, right? Or academics too. But for us persons in the everyday world, as we navigate our everyday existence, we interact with others, we take it for granted that in our society, our definitions of, say, race or gender or nation for that matter, they're just natural, right? Because we live in that world, we're immersed in it, we don't question it. Even though, as I mentioned, different cultures have different ideas about race, gender, or other things, right? Okay, so what happens here is that the act of naturalizing or normalizing, to use that term, all this socially created phenomena leads to what scholars called reification. Okay, now the root of this term in Latin is re. Re means a thing. Okay, so what happened, just to work off the term re as a Latin term, certain things that are socially created become things. Okay, they become, quote, real. So reification is when something which is socially created comes to be taken as natural or obvious. It's actually misunderstood or misconceptualized as being natural. Because again, we forget or we don't even think about the fact that it was socially created. Indeed, it's normally the case that the aspect of social construction is not even realized by most people, okay? Like race, like gender. We don't realize that gender is something that's created gender behavior, gender roles. We take for granted that it's not a social construction that we created it, right? And there's variations throughout history, throughout culture, different cultures, and so forth. Now, here's what's important to realize it. Once it's reified, once it becomes normalized and taken for granted as a real thing, and once it's forgotten that it's a social construction, it may not be, quote, real, but it does have a real impact on society. This is obvious in the case of race. Sure, we may have created some legal aspects of what is black, what is white, and so forth, what is, say, oriental. But once it does gain, quote, life, once it gains some sort of, quote, reality, well, the impacts upon society are very real. So it's interesting to note the irony there. Something that's socially created has real impacts on society, right? So this is important to discuss and to realize when we think about a social construction. So what we're going to do now is, move beyond some of this more abstract and theoretical material, which to some of you is something new, right? Perhaps you never uh, thought about things like this as being socially created. And, perhaps the idea of race as being socially created might be something new to you, right? This idea of, let's say, for example, the one drop rule that we discussed, where, it was less about appearance than the social and cultural mores of certain societies in the South. Some southern states said, hey, if you even have, quote, one drop of Negro blood, quote unquote, right, then you are still Negro, regardless of how you looked. If you were green eyes and, brown hair, it didn't matter, right? You're still Negro. And this again shows how, race is understood in that particular legal system, and it differs from other cases. Okay, so again, this is one example of how race is socially constructed, but it has real impact on society, as we mentioned.